I've never done anything this intense and concentrated with Emily Dickinson before, where what we're doing with all of these poems is a reading with the poem on screen, a an analysis, a nihilistic interpretation, and a hauntological interpretation, followed by a reading which is overlaid by pictures generated by AI once the poem itself is fed in to an AI image generator. Now, one of the things that has been very interesting to me as this process has played out is that there are some poems from Emily Dickinson that I think are just visually good looking. I think today's poem is visually good looking. It's two little, basically dialogue bubbles. It is a nice, visually aesthetic poem before you even get into the reading. As far as an analysis is concerned, now, no, so what happens is a lot of times these poems lend themselves. Maybe it's a pretty poem. It's nice to look at. It's visually aesthetic. Maybe the analysis part of the poem, there's some really interesting rocks to wriggle out of that thing and sort of look at a little more extensively. Sometimes, because the next part of the analysis is a nihilistic interpretation, the poem itself lends itself very strongly to a nihilistic interpretation. Others lend themselves very credibly towards a hauntological interpretation. But basically, all of them have been good for the AI art generated reading part of things. There's been a couple that weren't, but all of the poems are basically good at one or two of those aspects. If there's a really easy and obvious hauntological interpretation, the nihilistic interpretation has been very difficult to wriggle out. If the poem is extremely nihilistic in nature, normally, because of my own biases, I have a difficult time wriggling any other interpretation out of the poem. But today's poem, one of the interesting things about today's poem, I think it's a really pretty poem to look at. It's aesthetically pleasing just on the page. I think there's an interesting point to talk about with the poem itself. It lends itself very easily to a nihilistic interpretation, and there's a really good hauntological explanation for this poem. But apparently, when you feed this particular poem into an AI art generator, it just doesn't know what to do. I got generic picture after two or three lines from the poem imposed on the page, and the image's several colors just sort of split down different sectors of the picture itself. I don't know what, so I picked two pictures for this video that came out that were at least interesting to look at, but seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with the poem itself. This video is part of three separate playlists here on the channel. Number one being obviously the Echoes of Emily playlist, but number two being a playlist of Emily Dickinson poetry discussions, and third, the general playlist for poetry discussions. If you like or appreciate the work that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing that I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. So consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more literature in the future. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain. And then those little anodynes that deaden suffering. And then to go to sleep. And then, if it should be the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die. The heart asks pleasure first. Now, this is a... what are we doing here? This is a poem that is seeming it's I want to say seemingly simple, but in fairness, it is simple. It is simple on the page. But we're going to get into a little bit of why that is so profound. This is so when you're talking about literature, a lot of times what ends up happening is that you tell the big through the small or the small through the big. If you were trying to tell a story about how absolutely devastating and tragic the Civil War in the United States was, you tell the story of an individual person. One guy in that war, what happened to his life, right? That's how you tell the story of tragedy of the entire Civil War. If, however, you want to tell the story of how dangerous it is, how dangerous human jealousy is, if you want to tell that story, what you do is you make the Queen of England jealous. And so they go to war with France, right? That's what you do if you that's Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare is about all of the small stuff in the human character, but it's told in a lot of grandiose ways. um, now, obviously, some irony pops up there in that what he's doing is he's using a lot of actual events from time to time that do tell the big picture through the individual. But that okay, Shakespeare's not a very fair example because he tells the big through the small at the same time that he's telling the small through the big. Not a lot of authors can get there. But what this poem is, that's a weird sidetrack. But what this poem is it's telling the mind altering, heart racingly tragic through the banal. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But the first thing I want to talk about here is this. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be, the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die. Going to sleep is a very small, and I'm going to use a metaphor here because of the platform, self-deletion excuse, self-deletion substitute, self-deletion insert, right? There's probably been a time in a lot of our lives where things are just going bad. You don't have hope on a daily basis. You have nowhere to be, nothing to do, no reason to start. And so you choose sleep. Now, in the same way that there are cycles to the human emotions, in the same way that there are cycles to human life, in the same way that when I say summertime, what that can be in metaphor is the time of your life where you are supposed to be working. What that can mean in metaphor is the time of day which is good, which is productive, which makes you feel strong. If I say the winter, on a day cycle, what that means metaphorically is nighttime. On the life cycle, what that means metaphorically are your last years, the times where you are not as active as once you were, right? So, this, the heart asking to go to sleep, is the heart begging that small death. Not La Petite Mort, right? Not that one. That's Wild Nights. Um, this small death is the end of the day. And poetry is where we get to run these thought experiments and learn about ourselves that our lives might be better, that's dangerous. When you get into those places where you're choosing to go to sleep, when you get those places, that is dangerous because, like the poem here says, what's the next step? The next step is the big death. So, just a word to the wise. If you have been there, you understand what I'm saying. So, the other thing that's necessary to talk about in this poem, let's read this one more time. The heart asks pleasure first, and I'm going to change the tone here. I'm going to change the tone to make this point. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die. Do you see how different this poem is when it's stated as a matter of fact? The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain. What does that make it sound like? That makes it sound like I know exactly what I'm talking about. Do you think our speaker here knows exactly what they are talking about? Do you believe that our speaker here has had their heart ask to go to sleep? Our speaker here has had their heart ask the liberty to die? The question, so there's no alternative offered here. The heart asks pleasure first, and if the heart gets what it wants, it opens further. No. There's no question here. This is A, B, C, D. Our speaker is saying the heart doesn't get what it wants. It's not going to get what it wants. So what I'm doing here as the speaker of the poem is telling you, hey, get used to this. Be ready. Your heart's going to want something and it won't get it, right? So the next step is it's going to ask excuse from pain. And then those little anodynes that deaden the suffering, deaden the pain, make the pain, tamp it down. Our speaker here is basically informing you the heart does not get what it wants. And this message is banal. There's the old sort of adage that everyone is born to die, right? And of course we are. It's the only thing we know is going to happen to us. There are people that go before they have to pay taxes. So this whole thing of, oh, the only thing that's sure in life is death and taxes. Well, some people never get to the taxes part, right? Some people aren't even that lucky. Some people aren't lucky enough to pay taxes. So what we have here is the same type of warning from our speaker. You're born to die, and your heart's going to want something and be denied. The sadness in this poem is banal. The sadness in this poem is assumed. The sadness in this poem is just a matter of fact. Your heart will go empty. And because of it, it will want to die. Now, I said that part about you tell the big through the small or you tell the small through the big. There's also, this is telling the sadness through the banal. This is telling the emotion through the banal. There's a poem by William Carlos Williams known as This Is Just to Say, and it goes as such. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. That's the banal, right? But what do you get out of that poem? If we want to be pretentious, and of course we do, we're here. This is a suffering relationship. Our speaker in this poem is getting revenge for something that the person whose plums they were had done, right? So, what we're getting through this is we are getting the dramatic through the banal. In this poem, the dramatic is made to be banal. It's just very matter of fact. Hey, you're going to be brokenhearted. Get used to it, sister. Now, nihilism. This is a form of weak nihilism. Strong nihilism says we must go out and attack. We must go out and knock over all the buildings that we can knock down, because if we can knock them down, they weren't fit to stand. Then we got to build those buildings of our own. We got to build those buildings that will stand. That's what we have to do as nihilists. We have to create morals, values, and beliefs of our own. Now, if those old morals, values, beliefs, buildings, structures, mores, if they stand, if we go out and we really give it a go, and they withstand that blow, oh, that's good. But when they don't, we have to build something in their place. That's strong nihilism. Weak nihilism says, well, I went out there and I pushed all the buildings down. And because the old buildings didn't stand, what are the odds that we're going to put up good new buildings? It seems buildings have failed. We have gone out and knocked down all of our morals, values, and beliefs. That which the heart had wanted had failed. And so, why build a new building? Why build a new pleasure for the heart? Why go out and do that? It's just going to fail. And then we will ask the liberty to die. As far as hauntology is concerned, let me do this. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be, the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then the little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be, the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain. See how well this just loops and loops and loops and loops? There's no definitive end to this poem. You can just go from the liberty to die, the heart asks pleasure first. This could be an unending loop of the heart asking pleasure first. Now, what does that mean? There's no real end to this poem. If you read it again, it is almost as if the heart is just asking pleasure and being denied and asking to die. And then we wake up in the morning and we refuse to answer the existential call. And then the heart wants something, and that, right? In that way, what this feels like is the heart haunting, the heart itself being the source of recurring agony. This is all represented as a cycle, the recurring agony of haunting. What is a ghost? There is some theory, if ghosts were to exist, that what a ghost is a psychic presence forged by the agony of someone repeating itself in that place, right? It is sort of the indentation in your bed, right, is there because you've laid in it so many times. A psychic force, a psychic trauma can leave the same sort of energy in a place, which is sort of what hauntology is speaking about. But that's what this poem, if you read it on a hauntological level, is doing. The reason that this is so easily repeatable is that it is a haunting, a recurring, a manifestation that keeps looping in the way that ghosts haunt. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die.